Hi, everyone. I think it is time for us to get started. So first of all, I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar called Coding the Column. It's so good to see so many familiar names and faces, as well as new names that I hope to meet. So before we begin today, we ask that you please mute your microphones and please turn off your video unless you're speaking to save on internet bandwidth. If you have any questions today, please type them in the chat box. And also, please abide by the code of conduct that was distributed with the meeting information. So I'm Leah LeVay. I am at the International Ocean Discovery Program at Texas A&M University. And myself and the other meeting hosts today are principal investigators on a project called Extending Ocean Drilling Pursuits, or eODP. And what this project is doing is migrating ocean drilling sedimentary lithology, microfossil abundance, and age data to existing database platforms. And Andy is going to talk some more about that in a little bit. But the underlying key to this project is that synthesizing stratigraphy is really important to what we want to do, and it can also be very complicated. There are many big picture science questions that can only be answered with large combined and standardized data sets. This can be done manually, but it can also take several years to be able to do this on one's own self. With the increasing access to data as publishers require data sets to be archived in open access formats, as well as the increasing number of sophisticated databases and associated tools, we're in a position now more than ever to make use of this technology to try to answer these large-scale questions. So focusing more specifically on ocean drilling data, combined stratigraphy information is necessary for many different studies. And this can include lithostratigraphy, biostratigraphy, magnetostratigraphy, orbital tuning of sediments, and other types of stratigraphic parameters. This is necessary for being able to correlate not just across different localities, but also across entire ocean basins and even the world. Age information can be particularly challenging, not just because ages can change over time with different calibrations, but also the user needs to be able to make informed interpretations on the reliability of age model data. Microfossils are as an example, are not just important for biostratigraphic markers, but also the full assemblage information can be important for tracking assemblage changes across ocean basins. And when looking at individual biostratigraphic markers, the overall preservation and group abundance can be really important when trying to make interpretations on the reliability of these markers. There are several different databases that currently exist that are or could be hosting data specific to scientific ocean drilling. And these databases and tools could potentially be combined or expanded upon to make the most of all of the legacy data that's out there. Today, we are joined by representatives from 8 different projects that will present their platforms. And these projects range from databases and projects that are specific to scientific ocean drilling, to those that are more broad in the geosciences, but could be used to start housing some of this information. So today we're going to be hearing about Mikrotax as well as database management challenges from Brian Huber. We're going to be introduced to the Neptune Sandbox Berlin by Johann Renati. Isabel Fenton is going to be presenting on Triton. Anna Joy Drury will be introducing us to Earth sequencing. And following that presentation, we're going to take a quick break just so that we all can have a rest from Zoom fatigue. Following the break, Simon Goring is going to be presenting on Neotoma. Then we'll be joined by Bart Ewan, who will present on the Paleobiology Database. Shannon Peters and David Quinn will be presenting on Macrostrat. And Andy Frass will be presenting eODP. And with that, I would like to welcome Brian Huber to take over to talk about Macrostrat, Mikrotax.
Sorry. While I'm trying to fix this, just introduce myself. I'm at the Museum of Natural History. Okay, is that full screen?
Yes, looks good.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I'm a 4M paleontologist at the Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, and I've been involved with ocean drilling since I was a PhD student. And I was also on information handling panel many years ago in the early 90s, where there was a big push to build a database that can be used shipboard and capture shipboard data. And it's long been a dream to make these data available and grow over the years. And so I was asked to give a talk on the need for scientific ocean drilling databases. And this has been near and dear to my heart, along with a number of other people that have been involved with ocean drilling for a long time. Just a sort of a review, why do we need scientific databases? It's pretty obvious. These provide powerful search tools, quick access to information, and from this, you sort of get new insights, new knowledge. And what you like from databases is that they would be designed not just by database computer experts, but by experts who are familiar with the field. They know what the community wants, and they add those bells and whistles. You want a well-designed interface for easy navigation. The database should be regularly updated. You want options for user input, including new data that gets added by users. And pick lists. Now, oftentimes one size doesn't fit all, so you want users to have options for what they select. And you also want the databases to have wide community support, because this leads to their longevity and their use. Of course, there's a lot of ocean drilling data available now, but much of this is from the shipboard data capture. And so there's a bibliographic database. We've got the online volumes from DSDP, ODP, IODP. All the seismic data are in the site survey data bank. You've got tons of data on core photos, physical properties, logging, core recovery, geochemistry, and so forth. Originally in the Janus database, and then LIMS, which is an Oracle database of the shipboard data, and the Gulf Coast repository data, including the XRF. And then you've got the long-term data archive that's at NOAA. So all of this is available now. Back in the early 2000s, National Science Foundation had a big geoinformatics push, and they funded Chronos, which was funded from 2003 to 2006. Originally, this was supposed to be a 5-year grant, but it did not get renewed after 3 years, and so a lot didn't get built. The original goal was written there to really deliver a database that's based on time, in a time framework that can change as the geologic time scale changed. And this would link a whole bunch of different, a network of different databases for climate, for geochemistry, evolution, and so forth. I was going to have a central hub coordinating all these databases on the same temporal framework. They'd be interactive with lots of visualization tools, constantly updated, and so forth. And the schema is shown here with Chronos shown as the central portal feeding time for all these other databases. And so that was the goal. And you can see all the different databases that were going to be linked through this, through the Geoinformatics Initiative. Some things that came out of Kronos after the 3 years of funding, we had CONOP, which was a graphic correlation program, still used today. We took David Lazarus, really fine age depth profiler that was available through a JavaScript program called Age Depth Plotter. And this is still available today. It's a very elegant way of a user-defined age depth curve where you can move this curve and add any tick points from where the user defined the key datums for the age depth curve. And this output graphically as well as output the data for the age depth curve. So this is very powerful, of course. Age depth curves are not static. You start with the shipboard age depth curve, which is very low resolution. And then with time, you get additional datums that you have different degrees of reliability. And these things improve through time with more knowledge. So this was a very powerful tool that was available. And with Kronos, we linked to the Lazarus et al. Neptune database and provided some really nice graphical interface tools for presenting species, age ranges, and so forth, and a selection of different timescales to present these data with. There's also a SciCat tool, which is a graphical interface for collecting outcrop mythologies. And then the Neptune data presentation, where we could show a bunch of different information for the 4 major microfossil groups. So a lot of good things got built with Kronos, including the 4M taxonomic database, which I led. And Kronos presented a relational database for search tools and for presentation of data. With Kronos losing funding, that database died, but then we ported that over with Jeremy Young's work into what's called P4Ms at Mikrotax, which has a lot of really nice graphical presentation and search tools available. You can search on morphology, you can search on age. And so even somebody who does not have a lot of familiarity with planktic 4Ms, if they know a little bit about their morphology, they can narrow down identifications with this. And right now we're working on a proposal for building a benthic 4M Mikrotax database. So a lot of good stuff got built in just a few years, but it was unfinished. So when NSF pulled funding after 3 years, some key things never got developed, even though these were sort of the most important things that we felt Kronos was funded for. And one, of course, was the user ability to download different age models for deep sea sites, from DSCP to ODP to eODP, still not available. And of course, you want to do queries on geologic time. And so you might do a query for the Eocene and do searches on lithology, on species, and on fossil preservation, or a combination of all those things. And so, we still are back in the dark ages of having to search the literature and search the publications to get this basic information, not knowing what is the latest and greatest information that we could have based on published research. And so I guess my frustration is, after over 50 years of deep sea drilling, we still don't have this information, but you'll hear that this is in development. It's soon to be available with eODP and other initiatives. So I'll end it there. I'm looking forward to finally getting access to these data in a way that they should have been accessible a long time ago, but we're getting there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And it looks like we have a question in the chat from Barbel. And she says, thank you so much for this presentation, Brian. I see most of your slides do not provide any age uncertainties, and that is one of the big problems we have with ocean sediment cores and age models. Terrestrial reconstructions provide age uncertainties. In paleoceanography, we almost never report it, and most of us probably don't even know how to assess it in the first place. Can you provide some guidance on that?
Sure. One of the fine things that David Lazarus built and then Jeff Bowling built into the age depth plotter is just that, age uncertainties. And so you plot, the age depth plotter allows uncertainty for samples. And so the datum has a certain depth where the species has its last occurrence. And then you've got the interval between that last occurrence and the next sample above, or vice versa for first occurrences. And so the depth uncertainty is part of the age depth plotter, but also when there's uncertainty about an age datum, that also can be built into that framework. And so age depth plotter and the age models that I have published all present depth uncertainty and any age uncertainties for the datums. And I agree, this is a critical part of what we need to do. And with the age depth plotter, you know, the user defined age depth curve is run through those uncertainty intervals. And so if you're outside of that, then that suggests that you don't trust that datum. Or you need to go back and do searches, you know, to refine the age model. But yeah, this has been a long-standing push by a number of us that this kind of information needs to be presented graphically. Thank you.
I was muted. Thank you, Brian. And if anyone else has questions for Brian, please put them in the chat. For now, we're going to move on to Johan, who's going to be presenting on Neptune Sandbox Berlin.
Okay, are you all seeing the slides? Can you hear me?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so I'm Johan Honori. I'm working at the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin with Dave. So Dave retired a few months ago. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about Neptune and its current implementation, the Neptune Sandbox Berlin. So what I mean by that is, so it's a Neptune database has a very long legacy, right? It was created in the early 90s. It moved around a lot. It was part of the Kronos project, as Brian just showed. When the project ended, we ended up getting it back in Berlin, in Europe, and then in Berlin specifically with Dave. And we've been expanding it since 2014 in particular, thanks to well, financial help from ICO, who's around, I think. Yeah. So we expanded it considerably, in particular its stratigraphic capabilities. We also linked it to Mikrotax, which with Jeremy Young. It's still just run by me and Dave, and it's not our basic, our principal activity, unfortunately, but yeah, also it's not growing as fast as we would like, but it's still growing. So just to give you an idea of how much database changed since it's back to Berlin, this is just a very small graphic representation of what the database was before, like all the tables were linked. This is what it looks like now. So we specifically, yeah, this is a human readable version of that. We specifically added the yellow part, right, which is a stratigraphic layer. So it contains a lot of metadata, a lot of information that can be used to make new age model or to understand why we and how we made the age models, which I thought was very important. Just before going into the detail of that stratigraphic layer, I just want to present Neptune in general for the people who are not familiar with it. So it's primarily a database of microfossil occurrences in deep sea sediments. So it's working really just with DSDP, ODP, and eODP sites. with 5 microfossil groups: radiolarian diatoms, forams, nanofossils, and dinoflagellates. We have like 800,000 occurrence of them, so it's quite a lot for these 5 groups. It's mostly Cenozoic, those are calcareous ones. We have a very good Cretaceous record as well. You can see on the map, all the points are like deep sea drilling site, and all the red ones are the one we have in the database actually. We have data for, so we have a fairly good spread of data. So since we are talking, we're here to talk about stratigraphy. So the sample age, the age of each of the occurrences is actually computed from age models we have in the database, right? So it's just a line of correlation that really that associate age and depth together. It's based on biostratigraphy, magnetostratigraphy, occasionally some isotopic events. So nowadays, with the new stratigraphic layer we created, we actually store all that information. We have like almost 30,000 stratigraphic events and 5,000 calibrations for a little less than 500 age models. So we also we give a qualitative estimate of those the quality of those age models, ranging from very poor to excellent. Nowadays, we worked a lot on making them more and more accurate in the last 10 years. And yeah, nowadays there's just a minority of them that are really poor. I'm gonna go into the detail of that later. So that stratigraphic layer, so it's a yellow part of the database. You can see it's really in 2 parts. One part which is the age model library, and the other part which is a library of stratigraphic events. It's a fairly complex relationship, so I'm gonna just simplify it and show what we have. So it just starts with this table which gives a definition of events. It's very simple. It's, as I said, it's biostratigraphic events, magnetostratigraphic. We also have a little bit of isotopic data, but just the kind of data that can be treated as a datum, right? I mean, we don't really have a good system so far for cyclic data or for data that have a continuous relationship with time, right? But we're working on it. So you will notice that there's a column that gives the event extent. It's so that we can actually account for diachronism, so that we can have events that are defined just for a specific region and not globally. Then we have a table holding the calibrations. It's a separate table so that we can have several calibrations for each event, like updates or conflicting calibrations, mostly updates, obviously. It's important to actually still keep track of the old one, because then when you want to know why an age model was made like that 10 years ago, you can actually, right? Because you actually have the data that was used at the time. As was discussed before, we actually have the ability to have not an age, specific age for an event, but a range of age to account for the uncertainty. That table just contains the biostratigraphy and the isotopic events. The magnetostratigraphy, of course, it's a different beast, right? It's what's used to actually do the time scale, so it's separated in a different table. But you can see here that we refer to it because the age are still kept on the original time scale, because for yeah, so that we can recalculate it later to whatever age scale we're working with. Okay, and then finally we have a table in which we have literally what event was found in which site, which, you know, it's like the basis. Yeah, so with that in hand, we actually create age models, and I do mean we create them, like all the age models in the database are from us, I mean from whoever worked with Neptune at some point, because we don't really leave them from the literature, contrary to the microfossil occurrences or the stratigraphic occurrences. We actually make them. Of course, nowadays there's more and more sites that are astronomically calibrated, so we take those sections at least, but we still have to build an age model around it because it rarely is a full site. So yeah, that's what it looks like roughly. So we do a line of correlation. Because we're working, the line of correlation is just a series of line segments. We can actually enter it in the database just as a series of type points, which is what it is here, as you see. And then we have we keep the metadata, right? So we give the information about the quality of the edge model and why we say it's as quality. And if we use that part of the edge model from a literature, we actually keep that information here. Okay, so when we got the database from like in 2010 back in Berlin, they didn't have all that, right? The database was way more simpler. There was no metadata on the quality of the edge model or on how it was made. So we have to reassess all that. So it took us a while, obviously. There was a lot of fairly bad edge model, but because they were just outdated, I mean, stratigraphy is a science that evolved quickly. So we used a lot of statistical analysis to help us, like Pacman analysis, which is a method that Dave invented to identify based on microfossil occurrences outlying data. And but also just basically looking at the difference between the calibrated age of stratigraphic event and the observed age on a line of correlation. So that helped us really identifying what were the main offenders, and we redid them. We did a lot of age model for other sites that we don't have an age model for. All in all, since 2014, we did 300 of them, more actually. And just in the last 2 years, Dave single-handedly redid like 100 of them. So they're fairly good. We still have, you know, some poor or very poor edge model because, well, with the DSDP era sites with spot coring and rotary drilling, well, it's just the way it is, right? We cannot make them really better. So instead we offer the possibility to our user to actually filter it out, right? So that if we have an analysis that's really time sensitive, you can actually get rid of them. Since the beginning, I've been talking about those quality estimates, which are really qualitative, like subjective. We wanted to check recently if they were actually meaningful, and well, thankfully they are. When I did this small analysis, it's very naive. I'm just comparing looking at the discrepancy of calibrated age versus the observed age and per age quality estimate. And we can see that indeed it's the standard error is decreasing per edge model category. So basically, if you're not working with a poor or very poor, most of your data will have an accuracy that's a little lower than 500,000 years. So that's what we estimate at least. Okay, so we have a web portal that you can access everything that I just talked about, like the edge model with the metadata, the stratigraphic event calibration, the stratigraphic events as observed in sites, like everything, like all the metadata, everything you can already access with a website. But as Brian mentioned, there's also this edge depth plotter, which this is an update on that software that I made a few years ago. It's still a bit of a beta software because I'm still adding some stuff to it, but you can still use it. It's available on Mac, or if you're a programmer, you can actually use a script directly. On top of what Brian already showed, you can actually compare different edge models together. You can, you know, upload your own data and compare them with data that you took from the database, etc., etc. I mean, it's a very, very versatile software. So what's our future? I mean, our current plan for the next few years for the development of Neptune, we're going to integrate Triton to it, which is a database that Isabel is going to talk to you about after me. We want to have the ability to work with composite depth, sorry, instead of meta-velocifor, so that we can really integrate astrochronology. In particular, we want to be able to store paleomagnetic raw data so that we can actually test accuracy of actually the paleomagnetic interpretation of some of these age models. So, and it would help us actually quantify the error, I think, of the age models. We are trying to, with our team at the museum, our IT team, trying to develop an API for stratigraphic data so that all of you who have different system and database system, you can actually use our data dynamically. You don't have to just download the data and once and then forget about it. And yeah, it's better like that, so that it's updated as we update it. And then yes, I'm actually contemplating redoing that edge depth floater, but as a web-based tool, so that when I think it would increase its accessibility. I mean, the current version, if you need to be a bit computer savvy to use it, so I think it will be easier to maintain overall. So yeah, that's what I had to say. I didn't check the time, so I don't know if I'm over, but yeah, if you want to connect with Neptune, here's all the information you need, and the link to the software and the paper. And if you have questions, then yeah, obviously.
Thank you so much, Johan.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I don't see any questions for you specifically in the chat, but there is kind of a related question that's in here that was targeted toward Mikrotax. How often are the age models in Neptune updated? So if there was a new timescale or calibration, how quickly is that implemented?
Well, as I said, we're only 2 people to take care of it, so we have a bit of a lag, obviously. Mm-hmm. But as I said, also Dave just did like 100 of them in the last 2 years, so it can be very fast. Yeah, we try to update the main offender as fast as we can, obviously. New sites, they have to wait a bit. I mean, right now we're trying to make the quality of the old ones better first. But yes, we are actually putting new calibrations constantly. I think just today they've entered a few hundred of them. So just yeah.
But basically, we don't have the manpower to get everything into the system and update it all the time. So I think we are not falling that far behind, only because the drilling program is drilling less and less new sites that are relevant. Otherwise, we would be overwhelmed completely.
All right, and we have another question that was posted on the Google Jamboard, and it's pertaining to the depth scales. So how do you use the composite depth scales for age models? And is it possible to deal with updates to those composite depth scales?
Okay, so currently we are not dealing with them. We are translating everything into MBSF and working on a hole by hole basis. But of course, I mean, when needed, we use information from other holes or whatever, but always on translated to MBSF. But we are planning, as I said, to change that, to actually have tables that would hold the composite depth. I think the design will be the same as for the edge model, in the sense that you will have revisions to the edge model, and you will decide which one is the current one you want to use, and etc. That's, yeah.
I could amplify. We do take MCD-based age models and work with them to create the age models for the sites. By doing that more or less offline using the age depth plot program, because you can use an MCD scale with that. But then to load the final result into the database, because the database itself only supports meters below seafloor, we then map the MCD to the equivalent MBSF values for each of the holes. That one thing that's very tedious.
Yeah, okay. I see that Brian is asking if we will ever eventually allow users to upload their own age models. Yes, and I've been promising that since a couple of years. It's still, I'm sorry, I don't have the time to implement that yet, but it's gonna be a a function of the HDEV plotter actually, so that people can upload it directly from there. Yes.
Wow, it's a lot of work and a lot more work to do as well. But
Yeah.
very impressive. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so now I'd like to invite Isabel Fenton to present on Triton.
Work out how to unmute once I've started screen sharing. So hopefully you can now see my screen and hear me.
Yes, yes, we can.
Good. Okay, so this is only a brief introduction to Triton, which, as you heard in the last talk, is a database linked to Neptune. Origin of it was basically I'm doing a postdoc and we wanted to look at diversity patterns in planktonic forams through the Cenozoic. And so we decided completely logically that we would therefore find a database to do this. Started with Neptune and realized, as we've already mentioned, there's a lot of other data out there. And so I somewhat foolishly decided to put this into a big database. It's not on the same scale as, or not with the same ambition as something like Neptune or some of the others we're hearing about later, because the intention is not that it will be continuously updated. I mean, it's going into Neptune, so it will be through that method. But the Triton has been created as a snapshot in time, a single thing to let us answer the questions I'm interested in. And it's now been published and is freely available to download as an R data file. So you can access it all and play around with it whenever you like. Details will be at the end of the talk. So, as we've already been talking about out there, but it's often in different formats. It's not easy to get it together, to track it down. And as we've mentioned, it's can be difficult. Taxonomy can be difficult. So I've been focusing on bringing it all together and trying to combine it into a single data set. So that was our aim. Looking at the age models themselves, there's varying different sources. So Neptune data has good age models, other sources it's less good. In some cases it's just magnetostratigraphy, like this. We've updated that to the 2020 timescale. And the simplest way of getting a continuous estimate of age with depth is just to do an interpolation through those magneto ages. So you have your point, you have a estimate of a straight line between the start and the end of each magneto zone. Stratigraphic zones, similar process, but then that taxonomy changes much more than magnetostratigraphy. So you have to update the taxonomies, work out what the different biostratigraphic markers are for that event, translate it to the new system, and so that took quite a bit longer. In the associated files on the with Triton, you can see all the synonymies that we've used. You see how we have things you disagree with, you can change them, and theoretically you can update them yourself to create a slightly more up-to-date version of Triton. But yeah, so you can do the equivalent biostratigraphy with interpolation, or you can get slightly more technical, combine magneto and biostratigraphy together, and then fit a smooth curve through it. So assuming generally continuous sedimentation, and that will give you an estimate of age at any depth horizon you're working with. The method also allows for there gaps in sedimentation. So if there's a big enough gap, it will assume that there isn't sedimentation going on. It'll recalculate a separate gradient for the start for those events. A couple of other things integrated all that updated. Neptune is working on this as well, so that will be in there. But stuff that wasn't from Neptune, we needed to make sure it's using the latest stratigraphy. That has been very helpful for that. And challenge of we wanted consistent estimates of abundance. There's lots of different ways of measuring abundance. So present absence, binning it into rare, frequent, common, abundant, or counts of individuals, or relative abundance. We had to make sure that it was clear which methods were being used for which, because, for example, A can sometimes mean absent and sometimes mean abundant, and they're really rather different things. And similarly, presence of one individual or 1%, or one is sometimes used to just imply it's present. So we ensured that all the abundances are consistent. In terms of what's actually in there, a large amount of this data ended up coming from Pangea, a lot of which is relatively recent, small studies. Then it's, well, LIMS and varying other ODP reports, Neptune, Sens, which is the modern database, and then a couple of small other sources from elsewhere. And if you compare spatiotemporal coverage, so here we've got age against latitude plotted for Neptune, look at the equivalent plot for Triton, and as you can see, there's a lot more data in there. It's a lot more consistent. So yeah, this is feeding back into Neptune in the long run, but at the moment, it's just a snapshot database that you can use as is to get some answers to questions. And so, in summary, big database, freely downloadable, go play, have fun, and it seems to be complete enough to give us relatively consistent answers to things. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That is a huge data set.
Well, yeah, I got slightly carried away.
Oh, wow. So with all of the information that came from Pangea, did you have to extract all those files and format them manually?
So there's an R package that somebody's written to extract them all. So I searched, filtered it by those that mention planktonic forams or planktic forams with some sort of age metric. And that got me a few thousand. And I then had a series of semi-automated filterings to say, does this actually have anything useful in it? So as much as possible, it was automated because I did not want to sit there and go through by hand. But there had to be some bits where you adjust it when necessary.
Yeah. All right, so if anyone has any questions for Isabel, please put them in the chat. So I think we will move on now to the Earth sequencing group. And so I'd like to invite Heiko Palika and Anna Joy Drury to present. And I also would like to apologize to Heiko for overlooking him in the introduction earlier.
Oh, no problem, Leah. Can everybody see the slide and hear me?
Yes, it looks good.
Right. Yeah, so I would like to present today on behalf of the Earth sequencing team. This was a project funded by the European Research Council from 2014, and the funding ended in 2019. And it was mostly focused really on paleoclimate and orbital cycles. One part of that, though, is also related to developing scientific workflows and a database system from which we can extract some of these signs. So I'm going to present together with Anna Joy. She's going to show you something about core images and related science. And I think I saw David de Fleischauer also in the audience. So we have got three members of that original team represented today. Thanks, Leah and team, also for organizing this meeting. I think it's been long overdue and echoing kind of the initial statement that Brian Huber made. So the Earth sequencing project, as I mentioned, really was mostly related to paleoclimatic reconstructions and astronomical forcing in the past. And you can get the flavor of the kind of work from this slide. In particular, perhaps the megasplice work that has been published over the last few years under the lead of David for the two figures here shown on the left. But I just kind of want to also draw your attention to this kind of paper that probably does not get cited very much, but that is what was one of the underlying reasons to do the kind of work I'm going to talk about with Anna Joy today here, which is to really kind of analyze homogenized DSDP, ODP, IDP data. And that was done in this paper. And I'll show you why we had to do the work that is necessary. So I won't go through all the other Earth sequencing aims, but really just focus on one of the last work packages. And that was kind of conceived at the time when many of us kind of, in order to develop paleoclimatic data sets, probably went through a workflow system that consisted of copying and pasting text files between different systems, importing into maybe Analyseries and MATLAB, plotting with some other tools and so on. And I got annoyed with that at some stage. So the idea really was to set up a kind of integrated system that could do all of this and update age models and so on at the click of a button, rather than going through the error-prone process of using so many different tools. And so this is really kind of conceptual figure from the original Earth sequencing application of what we had in mind to develop. And some of that has come to fruition, and a lot of it is still to be done. So some of the database work that I'm going to talk about today was also conceived during IDP Expedition 320. That took place, I think, in 2009. And that was the time when the JR just came out of refit, and when a lot of the support structures and support software were also changed. I think that's when LIMS started, and we had a lot of trouble with LIMS originally because it was very easy to get data in, I think, but it was almost impossible to get anything out again in a quick way. And so that was one of the motivations to start off. But then I mentioned already that in order to make progress on kind of an integrated analysis from different data sets and sites, one needs programmatic or machine readable access to data. And that kind of also requires that the data are homogenized throughout the DSDP, ODP, IDP phases. Many different data formats and column names and so on existed. And similar to the biostratigraphy, what previous speakers have shown, a lot of this needed to be homogenized so it can be accessed in a kind of similar way. Now, I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by semantically tagged, because it is also very useful to have these data sets in a format where you, for example, know which column is a depth column, which column is the main data value column, and so on. And the other problem that we encountered working with these data sets from regardless whether it's NOAA or from JANUS or from LIMS is that the access time, if you do things over the web, is really important to allow kind of machine-aided analysis. And so we really did a lot of tricks and spent a lot of time in trying to optimize the access to these data formats through compression, for example, and fairly special file formats. So just to give you some reminder of course, how, from a web point of view, it works. On the left-hand side, you would use the LIMS system, in this case, manually to get a particular data set. And the problem is that the LIMS database, as it's currently in use, is very flexible, and it's been designed to accommodate very, very many different use cases. But to actually retrieve data from it is, as a consequence, pretty slow. So for one particular data set from a particular hole, it might take anywhere between 30 seconds to sometimes a few minutes to get all of these records assembled. And so as part of that, we actually organized our data a little bit differently. And you can see on the right-hand side, the download that is already finished. We tried to really make a really simple system for kind of manual access of these data. And we also have a way to actually access these data programmatically. And it takes, for most of these data sets by whole and analysis, just a few seconds to actually get it downloaded. So I probably, given that we're a little bit behind of time, won't spend too much time now talking about the technical details. Just to say perhaps that we have kind of two main databases really that are partly linked. One is related to the DSDP, ODP, IDP core data, mostly multi-sensor track data, but also some carbonate data for our use case, aggregated by whole and analysis. They're accessible both interactively on a web page, but also programmatically through machine readable interfaces. And then on the other hand, also a partly separated system that deals with large volume image data. Luckily, eODP now has all images of core sections digitized and digitally taken in the first place, but there's a lot of old DSDP, ODP sites for which that is not the case. And we have made some effort that Anna Joy is presenting a little later on how we can also access these data. And they're immensely valuable for stratigraphic correlation. So for example, the tools like Corelizer and Correlator that people have been using on the ship, they use a similar approach. But again, we made a big effort to make this access really fast, and you don't have to spend minutes or hours in some cases downloading a lot of these data. I forgot to mention at the beginning, there's also a web page, which is not quite up to date, but where you can get a lot of the detailed information about what kind of data and in what format we have made them available. And so, for instance, we are storing all of the usual metadata, so expedition, site, whole occupation, core section, etc. But also, quite importantly, we are storing, at least for a subset of the sites, the published core affine tables and splice tables, so the information that is required to shift individual core section data up and down. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, because we'll hope to expand that in the future. So I mentioned, and for most of you, this is probably not of great interest, but we have a machine readable access available to all of these data. The endpoint is listed here. And for people who are interested in using that, please feel free to get in touch. And so this actually allows the retrieval of much of the data and stratigraphic information, etc., in a programmatic way. We also developed quite a few tools to either visualize or process the data that are available. Currently, I think we have about 13,800 individual combinations of analysis and whole. And one of the cross-platform tools that Sergei Kotov put together during the sequencing project was this DB Viewer program that is available for Macintosh, Windows, and Linux, which you can use again to quickly pick a particular site, whole, and analysis, and then quickly visualize, for example, these data before you, for example, decide to deal with that. And you can see here, this is where the semantic information becomes very important. The program knows which one is the depth column, which one are the data columns, and so you don't have to select through that. And various data processing components like removing jumps and so on is also available. You can also get recovery plots pretty quickly from this program. So this is all using the metadata that's been imported from the various DSDP, ODP, IDP systems. And we spend quite a lot of time paying student workers to do some quality checks on some of these data. There's probably still many bad data, including for the DSDP parts in particular, but we also did a lot of cleaning up. So the vision that I showed you at the beginning, that has actually been partly fulfilled. So we now have this scientific workflow system that you can use to select data and set up various data analyses tasks. So for instance, you can incorporate R or Python scripts. So that includes, for instance, Astrocron. And so this is an example that's currently shown here where data are imported from a particular ODP site and just a simple script to run a bandpass filter on these data. And so this system is currently a little bit dormant, but that is still the original vision of this project. And now I think I'll pass over to Anna Joy. Anna, tell me when you want me to advance the slides.
Thanks, Heiko, will do. If you could start the video, that would be great. So yeah, Heiko mentioned the image component of eODP, of the sequencing database. And this essentially allows users to access the cropped core images for key or several ocean drilling sites. So you can see you can zoom in on these core images and move them, for instance, if you want to compare them to the splice or use this for stratigraphic correlation. So you have the cropped images for all the different holes on the left, and then the spliced image on the right. It's these core images are plotted on the composite stratigraphic depth, so the MCD depth rather than the MBSF depth if that's available. Yeah, so they're all sort of accessible through this the IDP core image program, and also once they've been compiled, you can also access them through a browser and download them through a browser. You can export them to PDF, so it can be a really very quick way to access the core image tracks that are in the Earth sequencing database and display them and then export them for further use. If you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the IDP core image tool can access images from 3 sources. So there's the Earth sequencing section images from which are on the map in red from key ODP and DSDP legs. The green dots include images from ODP image projects, which was a previous project from 2008, and then several cores from images extracted using the Code for Ocean Drilling software, which are shown here in yellow. I'll just briefly introduce the 3 different data types and then hand back to Heiko. So next slide, thanks. So the Earth sequencing section images were cropped using the high resolution TIFF versions of the core tabletop images, which you can access through the Janus and LIMS datasets. This was done in a two-stage process, which Sergey set up. So there was automatic recognition of the core images within the core box photo, which is shown here with the blue line, and then a manual correction to identify any areas where perhaps the core box, the cropped area included part of the core box photo or part of the core liner, for instance. And one nice aspect of this is it also included an automatic rotation step to try and remove skewness, which you can see here on the right. So it's a section specific rotation, which then avoids having the situation that your composite core of a core image looks like the version on the left rather than the version on the right. And this was done for 147 key paleoceanographic DSDP and ODP sites, highlighted in red, in addition to all of the IDP sites which have line scan images already cropped and available, which are also accessible through the toolbox. Okay, so then the last slide, please. Thanks. So the other 2 data sets that are included and accessible through this software are the ODP image strips, which were automatically extracted from core table photos by Chris Jenkins, and it's available. A bit more information about that project is available on through that link there. Now the fantastic aspect of this is that it's a complete catalogue of all ODP sites, so that represents extensive geographic coverage, and also so over 600 sites there. Because they were automatically extracted, you do have this rotation issue, as you can see with the 2 examples on the left below, and additionally sometimes the core didn't quite or the recognition couldn't distinguish between the core liner or the core box, so sometimes you get sections which are actually included accidentally as the core box. And the last, currently the smallest component, are images that are generated using COD, or Code for Ocean Drilling Data, which is a software that Roy Wilkins and Thomas and myself and a few others have been involved with developing now. These involved the manual extraction of these core images. So cores, again, can be rotated to remove any skewness. There's a lighting correction, 3D surface lighting correction, which is applied as these core images often have single light point sources. So that will give you a sort of a shadow, which can create a nice 1.5 meter cycle if the shadow is particularly bad. So this is corrected for. You can then select the core tops and bottoms and then compile the images, which are also scaled to depth. Now, these are, at the moment, about 20 of these sites are available through the database, more hopefully to be added soon. They're also available through the COD website for further use within the COD program itself. Yeah, so that's got quite a nice availability of these image data, and as Heiko said earlier, it's very quick to access these, and you can copy them, and because they are quite they're downsampled, so they're very quick to load. Once one site has been processed the first time, it will be quicker the second time for whoever extracts them. So yeah, and it does unify the different outputs from Janus and Law, which is very helpful. So I'll hand back to Heiko.
Thanks, Anna Joy. And just a couple of more slides. So there's a huge backlog and future work that we still plan to do. So of course, we really want to augment the additional data sets that we have already kind of imported, but not tagged yet. So we've really just focused mostly on the multi-sensor track data and a few additional things like carbonate content. But there's a huge treasure trove of additional data that can be added, but that requires quite some manpower and some time. In the very last slide, I'll show you some approach that we've just developed in the last 3 weeks, which uses machine learning for image cropping, which is very fast and promising. And then we also are planning for future work using integration with other databases and processing efforts. So Roy Wilkins, who's in the audience, and together with Anna Joy and Thomas Westerhold, one of the chief architects of this fantastic COD system, we want to integrate with that more. And then also there's a project underway that Gary Acton, who's also in the audience, I saw, presented at AGU, I think in 2018, which was to make use of the core descriptive data that is now part of LIMS. And that's one of the huge advantages, that they are now digitally stored. But there are also actually ways to perhaps import some of the older ODP data. Some of you really old guys might remember this program called Apple Core, which was basically a tool to provide stratigraphic description and generate the core barrel sheets. I remember I spent a lot of time with Bridget and other people on LEC 199 using this. And we now wrote some software to actually extract some of the data from the original Apple Core files that Tamu provided us with. And so, we can actually augment our database with the LIMS data on what kind of sediment, for example, something is. Also for some of the older ODP sites. It's a little bit limited in the previous days. Most of those were actually drafted purely graphically, so one would have to import those manually. And then finally, Thomas Westerhold and I, together with Anna Joy and Roy Wilkins, want to actually make a kind of community effort through a grant application to expand our various efforts here to have a system for the scientific community to kind of track and update core composite depths, so stratigraphic correlation data, and that probably involves a combination of these various database systems, because just like I described at the beginning for the kind of workflow problem, Thomas, who does a lot of the work for stratigraphic correlation, has the same problem. People want updated core composite tables, and it's a huge amount of work to avoid mistakes and to do that. So we have a grant application we just submitted to make that as a kind of community software and system available. Yeah, and very last thing, sorry, I think we're running over time. This is a kind of demonstration of this machine learning system. So we actually put 50,000 old TIFF files through a machine learning system, which detects now in a kind of automated way and kind of a little bit more reliably than the old automatic way that Anna Joy showed from Sergei's initial efforts. So it now detects the outlines quite nicely and kind of stacks these together. And just to leave you a little bit of a smile on your face when you go through these images to check for quality, you sometimes find little gems like this. And that's the last slide.
Thank you, Heiko and Anna Joy. Based on the chats, I think it's safe to say everybody is very excited about what you're doing, especially with the core photos. So there were a couple questions in the chat that Heiko has already answered. And because we're running just a bit behind, we are going to skip the planned break and go straight into our next set of talks. So up until this point, we've been hearing from groups that are very much ocean drilling focused. But now the next three presentations are going to be from mature geosciences databases that could be utilized for scientific ocean drilling data. And have some really neat things going on. So next up is going to be the Neotoma database, and it's going to be Simon Goring and Jack Williams presenting. So I'm going to let them get started.
Hi, thanks. I'm just going to copy the link to my slides. So there, if people want to take a look at them, it's in the thing. And do I share my screen? Sorry, I should have been. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm Simon Goring. Jack Williams is also on the call. Jack, do you want to unmute and just say hi? Well, or not.
Everybody just working here. Good to see you all.
I'm also on the West Coast right now, so it is early, so it's a little dark. But I'm here to talk about Neotoma. So Neotoma is NSF-funded paleoecological database. It covers, initially it was set up to cover the Neogene, but that was a while ago, and the definition of the Neogene has changed. Mostly the records are Pleistocene in age, although we do have Miocene-aged fossils. Basically, just a brief history. So really funding for Neotoma kicked off in 2006, although it had existed as multiple constituent databases for much longer than that. But Neotoma is really a database of databases. There's 36 constituent databases, 39 different data set types. And that includes vertebrate fauna, insect fossils, pollen, plant macrofossils, isotopic records as well. But really, they're all structured around a single central data model that thinks about records in the context of site-based and stratigraphically organized. So there's a lot of different pieces to the Neotoma database structure. There is a central Postgres database. There's also a set of APIs associated with it. There are R packages and then online web tools. And so this is an example of the Neotoma Explorer. Jack, could you type in the Neotoma Explorer address into the chat window? Because I forgot to put it on this slide. This is the entire data coverage of Neotoma. You can see the involvement of the National Sciences Foundation in early development of the database. Also, here's the participation of the European pollen database. We've been actively involved in bringing in data from Latin America and Africa recently, as well as our Pacific partners at the Japanese pollen database and the Austro-Pacific pollen database. Obviously, I come from a pollen background, so that's a lot of my focus, but we do have a lot of other partners who are not pollen-based, including a lot of vertebrate paleontologists. Neotoma is an active database. This is the number. So we contain records by over 7,000 individual authors, data represented from over 120 different countries. There's over 40,000 unique data sets within the database, representing about 20,000 sites, and more than 6 million unique presence absence or more than 8 million unique observations within the data sets, and those may be presence absence, they may be minimum number of individual species of individuals, or they might be NISP, number of individual specimens. So the database is quite complex. One of the strengths, I think, and one of the reasons Neotoma has been able to persist is this highly normalized data model, which connects about 150 different data tables. It's meant that we've been able to be very flexible. We've been able to bring in new partners without changing the core central part of the database. We can just add sort of accessory tables to help support their different data types. And so it's really structured around this concept of the site, collection unit, analysis unit, sample, and data set. This information, so the database is available as a direct download. The link is right there at the bottom, or you can access it through the API, as Jack mentioned. But basically, the idea is there are sites, which are locations with aerial extents. In practice, some of these do wind up being points, but we use PostGIS, and so we do support complex polygons. Then from the site, you might have one or more collection units within the site. So with the example of a lake, you might have multiple cores within a lake. And in practice, that happens quite often, that there are multiple drives. And then within an individual core from a collection unit, you then have analysis units, which are stratigraphic units within the collection unit. Generally, we're defining them in a vertical dimension, although for archaeological data, that may vary. Then within the analysis unit, we have samples. And so samples represent a single data type analyzed from an analysis unit. So in practice, with paleolimnological records from lakes, we can often look at pollen, plant macrofossils, and plant fragments that would be used subsequently for radiocarbon in a geochronological data set type. So an individual analysis unit or collection unit may have multiple different sample types. Those different sample types get aggregated into a single data set. So this core here may have a pollen data set, and it may also have a plant macrofossil data set. It might also have a geochronologic data set. So this does allow us to organize the data really cleanly. It allows us to bring in new data sets fairly easily because most of the structure, most of the data model is already well developed, and it's just a question of adding new information associated with either the data set or the sample level. One of the really nice things is that this also facilitates the development of multiple different chronological models in a really, I think, ultimately intuitive way. So we can think of a geochronologic data set, which might have one or more, for example, radiocarbon dates associated with it. So here is, again, our collection unit. We have multiple analysis units that have samples with radiocarbon, stuff that can be processed for radiocarbon. That then goes to a set of chronological controls. And so this means that you can sample as much as you want for radiocarbon or whatever your age basis might be, but then select subsets of this. So if you find out that some of these dates aren't valid dates or for whatever reason, you can reject some of them, but we still retain all the information. You can also add things like biostratigraphic markers or other kinds of geochronological markers, for example, tephra units. That then goes into a chronology model, for example, Bacon, and then you build your chronology. So the thing is, because this is associated with the collection unit, rather than specifically with the data set, this chronology then applies to all the data sets within the collection unit through the data model. So it's nice, all of a sudden, everything can be updated at that for that one core. And then the advantage of this model is that because of the way it's structured, because the database is highly normalized, you can, if someone comes back again later and says, oh, there's a new type of chronology model, oh, we've got a new int-cal curve, or oh, we want to make different choices about what things we include or exclude in our chronological controls, you can build multiple chronologies for an individual collection unit, and Neotoma can store all that information and allow subsequent analysts to choose among those different chronologies. And so in practice, most of the data sets in Neotoma do only have the single chronology. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the data sets in Neotoma, because there are a large number of like individual samples, particularly from the vertebrate faunal community. But a number have 2 or more chronologies associated with them. And this is increasing over time, the number of databases, the number of records with multiple chronologies, in part because we're going through these processes where you can see there are a large number, there are different types of age model bases. So records with chronologies and calendar years, ADBC, calibrated radiocarbon years, calendar years before present, VARV years and radiocarbon years. And you can see there's a bunch of different types of models as well that are being used to build these chronologies. The fact that there is such variability means that there's a bunch of people doing large synthesis work. And one of the things people are trying to do now is rebuild all these age models so that when they do their analysis, everything uses the same age basis. So we're using the same baseline age model, we're using the same baseline age type. And so this is a paper written by Yue Wang in 2019, where she basically went through and used Bacon, which is a chronology model, use Bacon to redo a large number of age models in Neotoma. And those get added back in. There's also a semi-automated tool that we built called the bulk Baconizer that can go in again, and you can select a large number of sites. You can add your different parameters and priors into it and rebuild them. And this is really important because a lot of the records in Neotoma use the int-cal curve or use radiocarbon ages as the basis for their chronology construction. And as we know, int-cal gets updated semi-regularly. And so we want to be able to make sure that people can go in and update those records as needed over time. Neotoma is very committed to high quality data stewardship, maintaining provenance and understanding fair practices. And putting into practice fair practices. So all data uploads go through data stewards. So data stewards are trained on the data model, and they provide primary uploads for the data. There are software tools both within some of our core software like Tilia, which is one of the tools people use to upload data. There are also constraints on the SQL tables, and there's this state of the database reporting as well, which we've been slowly building out. It uses R Markdown to report on different elements of the database, so that we can go in and find issues in the database and fix them. DOIs are minted 1 week after the upload, so all data sets in Neotoma have DOIs. And then when that DOI is minted, we take a snapshot of the actual record as it is at that time, so that that can be recovered at any time. And so, right, okay, yeah. And so there's that. We have the APIs. They're fully documented using Open API, which uses Swagger and JSON. And so the APIs are machine, both can be used programmatically, but they can also be scraped using machines. We also follow science on schema. And so there are machine readable representations of data through the individual data set landing pages, which again, you should have the link to these slides, and you can click through that. We've also been working with the Paleobiology Database to create the Earth Life Consortium. So thinking about how these data models between different databases align. We have the release of an R package to manage the data. So this is in beta release. It's not on CRAN yet, but it will get there. And then the last thing I wanted to say, which I keep forgetting and now I've forgotten it again, was something else. That's it, I think. So if you have more questions, you can email me at goring@wisc or talk to Jack Williams. I'm also on Twitter at sjgoring. Jack, was there stuff that I forgot?
Hey, Simon, that was great. I was actually just putting in a note about constituent databases as a concept. So I'll add that in. Yeah.
Where are you going to add that in? Oh,
Chat.
In the messages. Okay. Yeah. So we do have, so we do have this concept of constituent databases. And so in there, the individual groups sort of retain ownership of their data, but it is represented in Neotoma, and we will then support them in terms of managing the data upload and data access. And so recently we've had a number of groups come to us and become constituent database members. Neotoma is represented with a governance structure. And we've also been working with Socorro Dominguez, who I think is also on this call, working with Geo Deep Dive to do automated extraction of records from the literature using machine learning approaches, and natural language processing approaches. So thanks. I'll stop sharing. Leah, you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much for your presentation. I do not see any questions in the chat at the moment, but if anyone has anything to ask Simon or Jack, please put it in the chat box or feel free to contact them. Oh, Jack, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just another thought to add. One thing I'll just add about Neotoma is I think we have a fairly sophisticated representation of time as kind of Simon has worked through, the control points and so forth. One thing I would say we do not have a sophisticated representation of is depth, and this has kind of come up with some of the other earlier presentations. We kind of assume that there's a single composite depth scale that is quote unquote the true one. We kind of hang everything off of that. So some of the spline and affine tables and so forth that has been talked about, we don't have yet. But as we've talked with Anders Noreen at the Continental Scientific Drilling Facility, and how do we kind of better integrate Neotoma services with their services, that's an area we'd like to build out in down the road, and we can learn from other groups there.
That's good to know. All right, thank you, Simon and Jack. So we will move on now to the Paleobiology Database, and I will hand it over to Mark Ewan.
So let me just introduce again myself, Mark Ewan. I'm at George Mason University, and I'm the chair of the executive committee of Paleobiology Database. There's other PBDB types in the room here, so again, anyone can feel free to chime in as I go through this. And just a word of caution: I am not primarily a database person. I'm primarily a vertebrate paleontologist who works on fossil marine mammals, but I like looking at the fossil record as a whole. So this is how I got involved with PBDB many years ago. and now help run the show, I guess. Okay, so our mission at the Paleobiology Database, this is our formally written mission statement, right? To collect all this information on the distribution of fossil organisms, primarily from the scientific literature, and use that information to document the history of life and put it in environmental and geological context. So we view ourselves as holding this data in trust. It's not our data, it's data generated by the community, and we just try to mobilize it and make it freely available to all. And that last point is one that we feel real strongly about. As we look forward to continuity in the future, we want to make sure that we keep all this data freely available to anyone who wants to use it. But in short, we want to document every fossil occurrence on the planet along with their associated data and just get it out there for use by whoever. And you can see our web address there if you want to go, since you're all on your computers, and poke around, you can. The system has a public interface, and you can see almost everything except a way to enter data on our public interface, which I'll show you in a bit. So just a few statistics on what's in the PBDB here as of the end of January. Like I said, most of the data comes from the literature. So there are almost 80,000 references with over 1.5 million occurrences grouped into what we call collections, which are holes in the ground from which fossils come from a relatively unified stratigraphic and temporal unit. And those are, we also have a system to keep track of the names of those fossils. So the taxonomic names, plus we track the opinion. So what people have said about those names, which is an interesting feature of our system I can go into in more detail. And this is just a quick shot, almost done in real time. I did it while Simon was talking. Sorry, Simon. I know a bit about Neotoma because there are partners in a few things. So I was paying attention while snapping this image from the PBDB's graphic interface. And these represent the collections on the planet from the Phanerozoic, where fossils are known from. And those colors are tied to the colors of the time units in the geologic timescale. And one thing I think becomes readily apparent from just looking at this map is there is a Northern Hemisphere tilt to our database. A paper recently came out from people who work with PBDB suggesting PBDB has that the data itself have these remnants of colonialism in it, and that the data is heavily tilted towards North America, Europe, and former colonies in North America and Europe, like especially Anglophonic ones. You can see quite readily there are much less data from Africa, South America, even Southeast Asia. And it's a problem for the database, it's a problem in the data, it's a problem in general. I think it's an interesting one for groups like this to discuss if you want to get to that later. But it is what it is, and we're doing our best to flesh out, take the data we have and get it into the system. One tool that PBDB offers its users, again, you don't have to be logged in to do this, is called Navigator. And Navigator is a graphical interface where you can tell it, in this case, shockingly, I've asked the database to show me cetacea or whales from the Eocene, which is the time they originate, and then reconstructed the world at that time. And PBDB uses the G-plates model, and it reconstructs the plate positions and thus the positions of all those collections back to the time that you specify. See here, something interesting in that most, but not all of the occurrences are concentrated in tropical to subtropical areas, as whales are thought to originate in these warm seas of the Eocene and spread out from there. So on the other side, I think it's really important to emphasize that PBDB is primarily a research tool. And so our goal is to facilitate research, and we want to document how we're doing in that department. And so if you use a lot of PBDB data, you can request an official number that you can stamp on your paper when you publish it. And Again, as of this late January date, there's 419 official publications, and you can access these on our website. We also facilitate a Google Scholar page where Google Scholar looks for any mention of PBDB data because a lot of people use it and don't ask for an official number, which is great. We're very pleased to do that. And there's over 1,500 of those on our Google Scholar page, which we curate episodically to get rid of duplicates and mistaken additions by Google Scholar's robots. And that generates, many citations to those papers. And if you calculate it out, the database has an H-index of 103. So, and you can see what we like is that those numbers are increasing over time, right? Like more people are using the data and they continue to use the data, which is one of our goals. And this is a way we can document that we're meeting some of those goals. Now, the data itself, I'm not going to give a full schema of the database. This is sort of a general schema of the data types that we have grouped into 4 bins. Like I said, everything in the database is tied back to references. So since we're extracting data from published references, all the different data types come from there. In green are the taxonomic data types, which are basically names and the opinions of authors about those names. In brown, there's a whole suite of data about the context from the fossils, both geographic and geologic. So we track rock type, taphonomic indicators in the data, where they're from, and then when they're from and what rock units they're from in stratigraphy. And then we have the occurrences, like which of these names are in these places. And we can also track some information about specimens. You can put in some specimen measurements. Primarily, we're not tracking specimens, but we can shift in that direction. We're tracking occurrences. Fossil A was found in place B from time C, instead of this particular fossil with this specimen number was found like that. But we can do that, but most of the data is not quite that refined. And like I said, again, to stress this again, all the PBDB data is associated with some kind of reference, and most of those are journal articles or books. We can enter unpublished data. We sort of make a placeholder reference. For instance, I entered a bunch of data from the Smithsonian collection when I was doing a project on the Miocene, and they had a lot of data that hadn't been referred to in any publications. So I, made one for the USNM Miocene marine mammal collections. And that's the placeholder reference. And you can actually download all that reference data. Like, let's say you do a project on Miocene whales, and PBDB can give you a list of all the publications from which data was extracted in either a CSV or RAS format. So you can then cite those publications in your work. So we really want to give credit not to the database. People always want to cite PBDB, which is fine. I think you also need to really cite the original authors, and this is an easy way to facilitate that. The taxonomic data, as I mentioned, is interesting in PBDB. So the names of things are important. So when someone says, I found, to give an example, I don't know, Dorodon atrox from this spot in Egypt, that's what that author said about their occurrence. But they also might say that this taxon was originally in a different genus. It was in Proseuglodon, and they might say, oh, Proseuglodon atrox is now in the genus Dorodon. That's an opinion. That may or may not be the case, but we enter what the author said. And then PBDB has an algorithm that computes what to call every taxon and what family every genus belongs to. And so on the fly, every time you look at PBDB taxonomic data, it's recomputing what the taxonomic relationships of those names are based on the opinions entered. And in this way, paleontologists often put sort of a history of the taxonomy. PBDB tracks that for you. And you can disagree with what PBDB said, and I would say most of the emails I get as the person who monitors the email is about errors in taxonomy in PBDB, and I often reflect that is not an error. It's what Bob Smith said in this paper, and they're just disagreeing with Bob Smith. There is no real Bob Smith. And PBDB can display this taxonomic data for you just to browse, or can you also download it. This is just a quick little taxonomic tree of the family Basilosauridae, which includes, my favorite taxa that I've mentioned before, Dorodon atrax. And it's obviously computed that the name is Dorodon atrax. It belongs to Dorodon, and Dorodon belongs to this family. So again, that happens every time you look at it. So if you enter some new data, it'll recompute these taxonomic relationships for you. Geologic and geographic data, again, is associated with a thing we call a collection, which is this intersection of geography, time, and geologic unit. And we can enter data from multiple resources about a collection. So you may start with one that mentions the hole in the ground. Other people say, well, I found fossils from that too. And it can be changed and refined over time as better ideas of the temporal bounds, the temporal values, and the names of those rock units evolve over time. Since we're entering historical data, what we call a rock unit from 1872 is not the same as 2022. And so we can update those with new data and keep associating those multiple references with our collection. So you can hopefully, if you ever have concerns about what is said about a particular collection, you can go back to original references and check yourself. Again, once we add all that data, both taxonomic and temporal and stratigraphic, you can make these cool maps like I showed you before. This is one of Cetacea from the Miocene. And again, the color coding is for the Miocene. And you can see they're not evenly distributed on the planet, which we wouldn't expect. One interesting feature of this map in particular is if you see there's like a string of them through the Pacific. Those are from someone who is trolling, as some of you might be interested in. Most of this is data from land that is actually from trawling on the ocean floor, and they picked up whale fossils. And so they weren't able to identify them very particularly, but they were able to at least guess they're from the Miocene, and that's actually a ship track through the Miocene, what they estimated to be Miocene age seafloor deposits. Occurrences, like I said, are just, what fossils were found where, and that's expressed at any level. So if you know it, if authors identify it to species level, you can put that in. In the example I just gave, they identified it basically to order, so they don't have to be very refined. But for some analyses, you don't need it refined. So we let people enter anything at any taxonomic level, because again, we just literally try to just enter what authors said rather than interpret them for you. And you can have, like I said, you can record these occurrences any way, as individuals, as specimens, minimum number of individuals. And one special occurrence type we do keep track of is which is the holotype occurrence. So which occurrence represents the original description of the fossil, that we can track that down as well, which sometimes can be important. And all these data entry functions I've been mentioning, how we enter data, have parallel search functions, so you can look things up. Often we try to look things up before we enter them to make sure they're not already been entered in the database to eliminate duplication. You can use the system just to browse, both as a general user, or if you have an account, you can log in and do stuff basically the same way. It's just we search prior to entry. If you're a logged in user, you can enter data. And you can also download all of these data. We can retrieve any data type, basically, and use all the different fields to restrict that download to try to refine exactly what you want. You can also tell the database to give you only specific fields. When I advise people how to use the database, I always say download everything, because it's not that much data. And if you don't download everything, you might forget something. And we don't want you to, like, halfway through your analysis, realize you should have downloaded a certain column. So I always just say, download it all, and then, don't use it if you don't need it. We also have this feature we call resources. So PBDB has really, over the years, tried to do many different kinds of things. And we shifted our focus several years ago to, not really shifted, but decided where we really wanted to concentrate on was getting data into the system and getting it out to users. And so we sort of offloaded much of the tools, the building of tools to our users, because we know a lot of them are very clever and have created cool tools for them to analyze their data. And so what we do is we facilitate users sharing tools that they've created with others. So we have a system where you can, if you create a resource, you can log in, type in a few bits of metadata plus a link to your resource, and then a human will look at it and be like, that's great, and will publish your link to your resource. And I sort of described it in terms of an analysis tool for other researchers, but we also have links to video tutorials, to lesson plans, to phone apps. There's a lot of phone apps that are really cool. And so what it does is it allows anyone who've created any kind of analysis tool or resource of any kind to share it with the world, which we think is great. Again, we're here to facilitate the use of the data, and we think this is a really great way for other people who've already created tools or are creating tools as they use it to share them with the world. And much of the way people who make analysis tools use the data is through our application programming interface, which you can use our web forms, you can use whatever, what we provide to access and analyze and download the data, or you can just hit the API yourself. And it allows, like I said, it allows users to write scripts to form any kind of analysis you want. And also people have created lots of apps to do interesting things with PBDB that we may not have ever even envisioned, right? So our data is just sitting there. People like Encyclopedia of Life grab it. The ePanda project is one I was on several years ago, which mashes up iDigBio data with PBDB data. Simon mentioned the EarthLife Consortium. It's another API which uses the PBDB API to mash up Neotoma and PBDB data. And so you can make one query to get data from both systems. And ePanda works similarly with PBDB and iDigBio. And so it's another way that we're trying to facilitate data exploration and use. PBDB has a lot. So this is just from my little rah-rah slide at the end here. We have a lot of data in this, and I think Simon stressed this, that it's in a somewhat standardized format. I think Neotoma is a little bit more standardized than PBDB, but we have done some standardization as well, which makes it available for analysis. And where other people are developing new analysis tools, and we too are working on a project right now to integrate automated data extraction from GeoDeepDive and to link the references we have using DOIs to online reference data. Our model was developed before DOIs were widely available, so we're kind of latecomers to that. But we can also mint DOIs for data sets. So when you create a data set you want to use for analysis, you can say, hey, I would like to archive this data set. We'll mint a DOI for you. So it can be, we will archive it for future use. And I tell people, when you're thinking about, should I enter data into PBDB? You shouldn't do it just for the good of society. Some people have done projects and then like, well, my data management plan says I should put it somewhere and PBDB seems right. So they think about doing it after they're done. And that's really not the way to think about it. You should be using PBDB as you do your work because it helps you do your work, right? And if it's a chore, then it's probably not the right way to go. And we want to have people enter data because it's good for them as researchers, and also as a sort of knock-on effect, it's also useful to the paleobiology community. So like I said, we're going to try to facilitate bulk uploads of pre-formatted data. We're integrating GeoDeepDive, and this creation of a data input API, we right now have a data output API, will allow us to recreate our, I don't say recreate, redo all of our data entry screens and allow people to do customized data entry screens as well, because we can just put up the fields that you need to do for your project, and then not show you fields you don't need to do. As right now, we sort of overwhelm you with many fields that you can skip. But this will help facilitate data entry and allow it to be easier for, say, students and maybe the people less familiar with the data to add to the system. And that's all I have right now, but I'd be happy to show you the system if you have any particular questions about how it works.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. So we are going to keep trudging on here. So we have 2 talks left. Macrostrat is up next, and then we're going to have a brief overview from the eODP project. So it does look like we will be going past our 2-hour goal. If you're available, we would love you to stick around and join us through the next 2 talks. So I will hand it over now to Shannon and David.
Great, thank you. Let me get my sharing going here. Hopefully it goes smoothly. Can you see the main screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to be talking about Macrostrat today, which is really a platform for multi-scale stratigraphic data and stratigraphically hung data. And I'm joined today by Dave and Quinn, co-PI on our Macrostrat related work. Before I launch into some of the details about what Macrostrat is, I thought I would touch on some of the things Brian mentioned actually in kicking off this seminar with the sort of importance of doing this and what our ultimate motivations are for Macrostrat. And I think those motivations are nicely summarized by this diagram. So the rock record and the sedimentary carapace of the Earth, too, of course, are really sort of the great integrator of Earth systems. A lot of Earth systems come together into this rock record, and a quantitative understanding of it in its completeness is really essential to sort of understanding the basics of our sampling of Earth systems in time and space. And so it's sort of an informatics framework for understanding the co-evolving Earth system. But these arrows in this diagram go 2 ways. Quantitative understanding of the rock record as a whole really allows us to better understand the coevolution of Earth systems, because the rock record itself plays an important role in how these Earth systems interact. And without a quantitative understanding of the rock record itself, we're missing a key ingredient in our understanding of the long-term evolution of the Earth system. So Macrostrat is really primarily motivated by the desire to provide a quantitative answer to questions like, how much carbonate is there in the continental and oceanic crust, and what is its age distribution? Was the area and age of composition of igneous rocks in the upper crust? How have shallow seas varied in time and space? How have hiatuses in the deep sea expanded and contracted over time? These types of questions that require information on the whole scale properties of the rock record are what motivate Macrostrat. And so Macrostrat, first and foremost, is a relational geospatial database that's designed to answer these and related questions by aggregating fundamental units of geology in a comprehensive fashion. How does it do this? Well, at the most basic level, what Macrostrat consists of are crustal transects that are compiled at multiple scales. And those scales can be very, very different. So for example, here, the column on the right is a very coarse lithostratigraphic scale column describing the age and material property distribution of rocks over an area of the Colorado Plateau on the scale of the Grand Canyon. So it applies to a very broad geographic area and consists of very, very coarse stratigraphic units that are defined on the basis of lithological and temporal continuity. Crustal transects, of course, for this community can also consist of the space defined by the width of a borehole and consist of centimeter defined lithostratigraphic units based on material properties down core. Despite the fact that these are acquired at very different ways, sort of continental scale, spatially aggregated columns versus boreholes, they share a lot of features in common and allow us to use some informatics tools to systematize and organize them within the same framework. And so what I'm going to do quickly is just give you a very, very high level overview of how Macrostrat does this, the Macrostrat data model, and then we'll move on to some results and interfaces. The basic unit in Macrostrat is called a unit, and these are lithologically and temporally contiguous intervals of the crust. And in order to qualify as a unit, it must minimally consist of the following: a primary lithology, though units may actually have multiple primary and secondary lithologies, and of course, a wide range of attributes assigned to those lithologies, like structures and colors and so on. It must have a chronostratigraphic bin. I don't know the age is not an acceptable answer in Macrostrat, but those bins can be very coarse. For example, Cenozoic would be an appropriate chronostratigraphic bin if the limits of uncertainty on the correlation of that unit are sufficiently large that the best you can say is it's sometime in the Cenozoic, or it might be as precise as NN11 in the Neogene. And we have a good system for managing chronostratigraphic bins, and hundreds of chronostratigraphic bins are arrayed in a separate micro database, basically, that manages explicit chronostratigraphic timescales. It also must have a unit must also have a thickness. Technically, this is optional, or it must have a position of bottom and top relative to some datum, for example, meters below sea floor. And then, of course, there's a whole wide range of other data that are optionally associated with units. This can be lithostratigraphic nomenclature. Macrostrat has 50,000 or so names and hierarchies stored for rocks. Environments of deposition and a bunch of other attributes are also accommodated. There's a system for linking diverse measurements to units. I'm not going to talk much about that today, but there's a bunch of other information that could be assigned to units. But one of the features of Macrostrat is that in order to be included, the bar is very low. Primary lithology, some statement of chronostratigraphic bin, and something about the length scale, thickness scale of the transect in question. So just to use the example on the right there, we might define two units and the denormalized representation of them. The unit one would be mud. It would have a bottom and top within the Pleistocene, would span 485 to 489.2 meters, and unit two, sandy marl, and so forth. And so these would be the fundamental units that are in data associated with them in Macrostrat. One of the key things of Macrostrat is that the boundaries between units acquire identities, and they have unique identities and attributes in the Macrostrat data model. They're defined by units in contact and a position in time in stratigraphy. And time position can be relative. So in this case, we have 3 unit boundaries that would have distinct identities in Macrostrat. The top one here would be bound on the bottom by unit 1. It would have no bounding unit on the top. In this contrived example, it would have a position, it would have a reference time interval, and it would be assigned proportionally within that time bin, and its boundary type would be a contact. What I mean by proportionally within the time bin, there's a sort of cartoon representation of what this might look like visually. The first unit boundary might be assigned to a proportion in the Pleistocene of 1.0, equivalent to 0 in the Holocene. The boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene might be the relative location of unit boundary 1 in this chronostratigraphic correlation scheme. Unit boundary 2 position, say 48% of the way through the Pleistocene, and so on. This allows our physical positions of boundaries to be hung within a time framework that's dynamic. So redefinitions to the Pleistocene propagate dynamically through to our numerical age model, for example, for these units. The time position can also be absolute. The boundary model can accommodate datums within a unit. It's really designed for the unit boundaries themselves, but the model itself underlying it can accommodate something like a first appearance datum. In this case, the boundary would be established at 482.2 meters, and it would be contained within unit 1, and it might have an absolute time position or a relative time position. The default age models in Macrostrat are really, and the population of the unit boundaries data structure is initially algorithmic based on available constraints, which include correlation to these chronostratigraphic bins, superposition, and thickness. And so these constraints are relatively simple, but they can be articulated algorithmically, and age models dynamically constructed from those constraints. And on the right here is just an arbitrary example showing one hole and the age model constructed from these constraints in comparison to one of the Neptune curated age models. There's a bunch of desirable pre-processing steps that you can do to improve the quality of your initial age model, such as separating column units into packages, groups of units that are contiguous, basically explicitly identifying unconformities, for example. And the default age model that you generate has as many anchor points as unit boundaries in time. And that's what's shown by these little black boxes here. These are all unit boundaries within the lithostratigraphic description. The age model is fully editable, but in an ideal world, this would always be built dynamically with robust methods from data constraints. And you might have several different methods by which you construct age models, but you could also have a manually edited version. Just to round out the data model description for Macrostrat, these units and their boundaries exist within columns. And so columns are objects consisting of one or more units. This would be a whole or a measured section or a regional column. And of course, the column data object stores a bunch of metadata applicable to all the units there. Within those columns, units are grouped into packages, which are temporally contiguous blocks. Column groups are available to organize multiple columns into logical blocks. For example, you might want to organize into an expedition, all the different holes for an expedition. And then projects are used at the high level to organize columns and column groups into logical blocks. And Andy Frass will tell us about eODP in that block in a bit, and I'll show you some interfaces for that. Okay, so that's just a high-level overview of the fundamental data types that are stored in Macrostrat. They're pretty simple because they're designed to capture the essence of what goes into stratigraphy, which distilled down to its fundamentals is complex in detail, but demonstrably unifying across multiple different scales. We have a nice RESTful API to interact with these data, and what's important to realize is that all the images and interfaces I'm going to show you are constructed from this API, but I wanted to show you some results and interfaces to give you a sense of what the data holdings currently look like. So for the lithostratigraphic scale composite columns, this is the geographic footprint. We're woefully limited to North America, bits of South America at this point, and a smattering of offshore drilling sites that have been composited at the site level for continuously cored down to basement sites. And so this is the geographic footprint of about 1,500 columns. Within those columns, about 35,000 rock units are hosted. And what we can do with these data in aggregate is sort of peel back the chronostratigraphic distribution of rocks in the upper crust. Here we have from 1 billion years ago to present, the chronostratigraphic stack in North America. The different colors are the dominant rock types, not so important for now, but blue is carbonate, for example, produce standard colors. And from this sort of space-time distribution of rocks, we can derive a bunch of aggregate properties that describe the whole rock record. For example, in the time domain, we might be interested in the total area of marine sediment coverage in North America. The black curve is the time series for all sediments that are marine in their environment. And then the blue is the carbonate bearing subset of that area. And so this derived data quantity that synthesizes the rock record at the continental scale encodes within it a bunch of tectonic and climatic signals that are pretty interesting and very difficult to acquire via any proxy records that I'm aware of anyway. They provide a nice complement to our understanding of the Earth system and give us some pretty cool insights, as it turns out. The analogous quantity for the offshore drilling components, again, these are only the continuously cored sites from surface down to near basement that have been selectively entered at the site level. And this time series describes the number of sites bearing sediments of the given age. And of course, a very, very different signal from what we see on continental crust, rather than continental flooding and changes in sea level driving what we see on the continental crust. We see the first order signal being the creation of seafloor, and then superimposed on this are fascinating changes related to ocean current evolution, bottom water chemistry, and so on. The next generation of offshore drilling, just to give you a scope of a sense of where the data are right now, and Andy will talk more about eODP, but this is now squarely within the eODP project. This map shows all the offshore sites. Those are already sort of stored in their metadata completeness in Macrostrat. And so this is the offshore drilling distribution that we're scoping in eODP. The blue points are data that have been entered for lithostratigraphic columns so far in the eODP project, and the gray ones are the ones left to do. So far about 38,000 lithostratigraphic units. This interface is constructed dynamically from the API, and the API also allows us to explore at the site level. So this is a Dave and Quinn's column render that attempts to render the lithostratigraphic log here. So this is what's shown on the left. And then the age model for this site is plotted dynamically there on the right with a little graphical interface that allows you to explore it. And this is just using the default age model currently. If you zoom into these units, of course, there's a bunch of data linked to those units. The original, in this case, the original lithology descriptions from the shipboard reports and various other data linked to this. It gets really interesting to explore the relationships between the age model within and between sites. And this interface is actually one that Dave put together for a terrestrial set of measured sections in Namibia that he's working with. But the fundamentals are the same. It's a dynamic web interface constructed from an API that has effectively the same properties as the Macrostrat API. And we are able to explore correlations in the age model as well as the lithological space together. And so you can imagine this kind of interface being present for a single site and the holes within a site, or perhaps more interestingly, holes between multiple sites spanning a basin or subbasin. Measurements get hung within the Macrostrat framework pretty readily, and we've integrated a very large number of measurements for a lot of the continental data so far. This is just a view of the web interface for exploring detrital zircon spectra for a given unit, and so multiple different zircon samples are aggregated together there to give a multiple different age spectra. And then more relevant to offshore drilling, hung measurements within a continuous lithostratigraphic transect, like stable isotopes of carbon and oxygen, can be hung within these units. And importantly, hung within these units in a way that acquires the continuous time age model age for those measurements rather than sort of declarative ages. And then finally, a few people have mentioned GeoDeepDive. So I just wanted to end with a quick heads up that a lot of these data are linked to the literature, although we are still building out the tooling to actually make this very seamless. The pieces are all in place to do this. So the XDD project, formerly GeoDeepDive, contains a very large corpus of publications, including all of the offshore drilling reports, and a machine reading system has indexed this corpus and generated a bunch of data products for the corpus. And we have a few little interfaces that allow us to explore it. Davin's created, and that's what you're seeing there on the right for a site search. Text tables, figures, equations, all of these elements are retrievable from this machine reading system. And so in the interface on the right, you're seeing search for figures that explicitly contain U1353A, not just from that volume, but actually the figure itself mentions that particular string. Maybe a little more interesting and tangible example, here's a search for a particular genus, and we're looking for tables. This table contains that genus, and we're able to surface tables from these drilling reports and other literature. And so there's a lot of potential to bring the semantic and spatial footprint provided by Macrostrat columns directly into a literature projection that allows us to start the process of extracting and linking data from publications in a very principled and explicit way. We also train a bunch of different age models, and so those of you who know this taxon will appreciate the extent to which this model makes sense, but these are the terms that the machine reading system thinks are closestly related to the search string based on context. Okay, so to conclude with some key points, Macrostrat's data structure accommodates crustal transects that are compiled at multiple spatial scales. Continental and offshore data exist within the same framework, and I think there's a lot to be gained by bridging the gap between onshore and offshore data more explicitly. The physical rock record is the primary key in Macrostrat. Physical stratigraphy is the grounding. Everything else is essentially a model around that. So models for the distribution of time within rock record and properties within rock record are then constructed from those constraints. The sub-databases within Macrostrat have a lot of utility I didn't talk about. So the lithostratigraphic nomenclature, for example, the chronostratigraphic timescale handling is very useful, lithology hierarchies, and so on. And we have a pretty solid infrastructure for accessing data and building third-party data visualization and analysis applications. And the eODP push that's underway is going to allow that infrastructure to be leveraged pretty quickly, I think. So with that, I'll stop. Dave and Quinn's here if you have any questions about the interfaces that were up, or if you want to see a live demo of that, he might. Oh, he already has put some links. So there you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. David, were you going to present anything, or just are the links enough?
The links are enough. In the interest
Okay.
of time, we just went through it in Shannon's piece. So
Okay,
yeah, just a lot of interactive visualizations of columns.
awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, we've got one more brief talk from Andy Frass that will take, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. So we will get wrapped up shortly. Andy?
Yep, it should be just 5 minutes. All right, is that good?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm presenting, thank you for sticking around first. So I'm presenting the eODP project along with co-PIs Leah LeVay, Jocelyn Fessa, and Shannon Peters, developers from Whirligig, Seth Kaufman, and Wayne Kwan, and then also an army of undergraduates and my graduate student, Katie Jamson, who's also working on the project. We are funded by NSF through the EARTHSEQUENCING funding scheme. So the idea of behind eODP is we want to leverage the success of the two previous projects that you just heard about, the Paleobiology Database and Macrostrat, and not steal their infrastructure, but bend their infrastructure to work for scientific ocean drilling data. So Macrostrat will host the age and lithology information, whereas the Paleobiology Database will take in the microfossil occurrences. So anybody that has dealt with Janus or LIMS, or even the data set that's hosted by NOAA encompassing the DSDP data, knows that you're dealing with .csv files, raw HTML tables, some weird Excel files that are completely customized, and a whole bunch of different APIs, and it's a mishmash of different data types. So the first thing that we've done is work on harmonizing that data structure so that it can be hosted on one individual database. So that is what you're seeing there in the blue. We've then also worked on doing some quality checks to make sure that data is actually good, spelled correctly, so species names and proper taxonomy, that sort of thing. We've been working on adding age models into Macrostrat. As Shannon said, Macrostrat won't take anything that doesn't have an age model. And so we've been incorporating basic age models for all of the eODP sites, and I'll talk about that in a second. So we started with the most challenging, which is LIMS, the most modern of the databases. And we've really incorporated about half of the data so far. Again, starting with the most difficult, and so things have accelerated quite dramatically after we got out of the modern era of data collection. And also on here is the Neptune database. So we have an agreement with Neptune that we are going to share information, and we are incorporating their age models as Shannon showed in the Macrostrat scheme. They are not a part of this intermediate database, however, that I'm talking about. So this intermediate database, which is a harmonized version of Janus LIMS and that NOAA data, we've been calling the baggage stripper because we've removed 50 years of baggage from those data structures and harmonized them all together. Our plan is to release this as a bolus of data basically onto a website via GitHub with some Janus documentation, several slices of the data that we thought were useful. So like the Pacific or the Atlantic, and basically explain how we got where we got with this information using some Jupyter notebooks, basically. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the quality control that we've been working on, because that's generally what the hours have been spent on trying to solve here. So as Mark mentioned, the PBDB has some really nice nested tables that do a good job of understanding taxonomy and some algorithms that present that information. One of the things we've had to do in order to get our data ready to go into the Paleobiology database is to put the basic level of microfossil taxonomy into the PBDB. So this is the genus level and then above. Most of this didn't exist. There were a few basically planktic forams that were entered already. As we've been entering that level of taxonomy, we've also gone through and corrected misspellings, improper genus species combinations that were never valid, and other improper taxonomy. And so there's been a lot of work done on the taxonomic side. So on the Macrostrat side, this is more on its infancy, but we have developed a workflow where basic age information is entered, and then it goes through some steps, and someone with a PhD or working on a PhD looks at the age model and verifies that it's at least a valid and sensical age model. These are basic, and the goal is to get basic age models in here and refine as scientific questions drive the improvements for those age models. So that's a bit in the earlier stages, which is why there are not as many holes as you can see there. But things have been speeding up quite a bit since. So our plan for the next steps is to finish the data incorporation into this intermediate eODP database that we're calling the baggage stripper, that we expect to be done within the next few months. Again, because things have sped up quite a bit. We're then going to release this baggage stripper with some documentation, and then we're going to turn towards working on some data import and export apps that are customized for microfossils. The PBDB entry apps are all set up for terrestrial macrofossils. And as anybody that does microfossil work knows, we're a bit different and have a different style for collecting and entering our data into these systems. And so we want to set it up so it's easiest for us. So that's all I have. As the last speaker, I really want to thank everybody, all the speakers and the audience for participating. I think this has been a wonderful examination and sort of demonstration of both the wide variety of work that's been done and is being done. And also it's really exciting to be a part of this kind of collection of projects and things. It's an exciting time to be doing this kind of work.
All right, thank you, Andy. I have one final slide to put up. Okay. So as Andy said, first of all, thank you all for attending this meeting, and a big thank you to the presenters today for spending the time to put together such great presentations and for taking the time to share that with us. We are planning to have a follow-up meeting, which will be a more interactive meeting with the participants. This will be April 21st at the same time that we met today. And the focus of this meeting is going to be on chronostratigraphy and age models. We're going to have breakout groups with guiding discussion questions. And so we're hoping to get a lot of good feedback and brainstorming through this. And I will be sending out a new Zoom link for this meeting. So if you signed up for attending today's meeting, you will be getting a Zoom link to the next one. I will also be distributing the recording of today's meeting. And with that, I believe that is all I have. So does anyone have anything to add before we adjourn?